Imagine standing alone in a massive library. The shelves stretch infinitely in all directions. Every wall is covered in books, thousands upon thousands of them. But the moment you open one, you understand. Not a single page is written in any language you could ever hope to learn. Not a word, not a phrase, nothing but symbols, beautiful, intricate, deliberate symbols that someone took hours to carve, to paint, to carefully arrange. Now imagine knowing something else. Someone desperately wants you to read this. Someone, 300 years dead, spent their entire life learning, teaching, refining these symbols. They carved them into stone because they believed, with absolute certainty, that one day their distant descendants would understand. They were so sure of it that they repeated these messages across entire civilizations. They built temples with these symbols. They wrote laws in them. They carved prayers into tombs, hoping that long after their bones had turned to dust, someone would read those prayers and understand. You are that someone, and you cannot read a single word. This is the silence we're about to break together. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, of information that exists, visible, sitting right in front of us, and yet completely inaccessible. A letter from 300 years ago that we hold in our hands but cannot open. The Maya civilization offers us the perfect example of this particular kind of heartbreak. For over 3 centuries, one of humanity's most sophisticated cultures left behind messages in stone that nobody on earth could read. The Maya weren't some small tribe. Millions of people lived in their civilization. They built cities that rivaled anything in Europe. They had philosophy. They had mathematics so advanced it made European scholars look primitive. They had a complete writing system, not pictures, but actual written language. And then centuries passed. The Spanish came, disease arrived, the civilization fractured, and slowly, then suddenly, the voices went silent. What makes this tragic is not just that the voices stopped. It's that the messages remained. All across Mesoamerica, carved into temples and palaces and tombs, were words that nobody could read. Historians would stare at them for centuries, completely baffled. They could see that these were deliberate communications. They could feel the intentionality behind them, but they could not hear them. It's like being deaf to a message that someone is desperately trying to tell you. And somewhere in those unread messages might have been the solutions we are still searching for. Maybe they knew how to manage agricultural systems in ways we've forgotten. Maybe they understood mathematics, were still struggling to relearn. Maybe they had spiritual insights about how to live in the world that could help us survive our current crises. We'll never know. Not because that knowledge wasn't preserved, it was, but because we couldn't figure out how to listen to it. The central mystery of this entire exploration is simple. What wisdom died along with these languages? What unique perspectives were lost? What crucial information about how to live, how to think, how to organize society went silent forever? The silence in this story isn't empty. It's full of ghosts. Before the silence came, there was sound. Not literal sound, though that existed too, but the sound of civilization at its peak, languages vibrant and evolving, words being invented and debated, new concepts being named for the first time. We need to go back to that moment, to before the collapse, to when these languages were alive. Picture Minoan Crete, around 1700 BCE. The palace complexes are thriving. Merchants from Egypt arrive with trade goods. The scribes work in rooms filled with light, carefully pressing reed pens against clay tablets. They're not recording some abstract philosophy. They're writing inventory lists. They're noting which merchants owe taxes. They're recording the names of workers. These are mundane tasks, but they're done in a language, a complete, complex language, that nobody can hear anymore. In ancient Egypt, at the same time, the Nile floods as it always does. The farmers know the flood is coming because their ancestors learned the patterns thousands of years before them. But now, for the first time, someone decides to freeze those predictions into permanent form. A scribe sits down and writes, not in pictures, but in a sophisticated system of symbols that represents both sounds and meanings simultaneously. He writes about the flood. He writes about the gods. He writes about taxes and love and death. He's trying to preserve not just information, but understanding. He's trying to make his civilization immortal through words. What's essential to understand here is that these weren't just communication tools. They were ways of thinking. The language you speak literally shapes the thoughts you can have. Not completely, you're not trapped in your language, but it constrains you. It guides you. It makes some concepts easier to think about, and others nearly impossible. The Egyptian language forced its speakers to think in images and symbols. This wasn't a limitation. It shaped their entire philosophy, their approach to art, their way of understanding the world. When you read Egyptian, really read it. Not just translate the words. You're accessing a completely different way of thinking about reality. The same was true for every lost language we'll discuss. The scribes of the Indus Valley developed a sophisticated, bureaucratic system. They had trade routes that stretched across thousands of miles. They had cities with sophisticated sanitation systems that modern archaeologists are still trying to understand. But the language they used to organize all this, we have no idea what it sounds like. We have no idea how they structured their thoughts. We have fragments of their writing system, but we cannot hear their voices. In marketplaces across ancient civilizations, arguments happened. A merchant disagreed with a tax collector. A priest debated philosophy with a scholar. A mother sang lullabies to her children in a language that would eventually die. A scribe made a joke that only made sense in that specific language, in that specific time. These weren't dry historical moments. These were human moments, living moments. Someone was frustrated. Someone was excited. Someone was trying to convince someone else of something. This is what we need to understand before we talk about loss. These languages didn't belong in museums. They belonged in living mouths. They belonged in arguments about trade deals. They belonged in prayers whispered in temples. They belonged in mothers teaching their children the names of things. The moment we stop seeing them as dead languages in old books and start seeing them as tools that living people use to think and argue and love and create, only then do we understand what silence means. Only then do we understand what we're actually looking for when we try to decipher the ancient world. Languages don't die overnight. That's something we need to understand clearly. They die slowly. They suffocate. A new power arrives, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through colonization, sometimes simply through economic pressure. The dominant language becomes the language of trade. It becomes the language of the courts and the government. If you want to buy or sell something, you need the dominant language. If you want to get justice, you need the dominant language. If you want your children to have opportunities, you need to teach them the dominant language. The young generation grows up bilingual. They learn their parents' language at home, but they learn the dominant language at school. They study in the dominant language. They make friends who speak different native languages, but all speak the dominant language. Slowly, and the native language becomes associated with the home, with the old generation, with the past. The dominant language becomes associated with the future, with possibility, with progress. A parent makes a decision that makes perfect sense to them at the time. They stop teaching their children their native language. They speak to their children in the dominant language. They want their children to succeed. They don't want their children to be seen as different or backward. Within a single generation, children forget how to speak the native language fluently. They might understand it if their grandparents speak it, but they can't speak it themselves. A few generations later, they can't understand it at all. This is happening right now. As you watch this, somewhere on Earth, a language is dying. The statistics are staggering. Approximately one language dies every 9 days. Some languages have only a handful of speakers left. Old people sitting in villages, unable to teach younger generations, because the younger generations have already committed to learning the dominant language. The infrastructure of language death is already in place. It's not something that's happening occasionally. It's constant. It's relentless. The Bronze Age collapse offers us a historical version of this tragedy. Civilizations that had written and spoken for thousands of years simply disappeared. The cause is still debated by archaeologists. Climate change, possibly. Invasions, possibly. Economic collapse. Internal warfare. Whatever the reason, entire cultures vanished. And when they vanished, the languages vanished with them. Linear A, a complete writing system used by the Minoan civilization, was abandoned. Nobody knows what happened to it exactly. It was written, it was used for administrative and religious purposes, and then it was gone. We have hundreds of examples of Linear A texts sitting in museums. We can look at them, we can see that they're writing, we can see that they're intentional communications, but we cannot read them. The knowledge of how to read them died along with the civilization that created them. The Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica was different. It was intentional destruction. Franciscan friars, believing that Mayan writing contained heretical and evil ideas, systematically burned the codices. Thousands of books, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, history, philosophy, spiritual understanding burned. Only 4 codices survived. 4, and everything else was ashes. And even those 4 surviving texts took centuries for scholars to decipher, even partially. What's important to understand is that this wasn't natural selection. It wasn't as though Mayan civilization naturally evolved away from their written language. It was suppression. It was violence. It was the systematic destruction of a way of thinking because the people in power believed that way of thinking was dangerous or inferior or wrong. But the worst part, the truly tragic part is that sometimes the language dies and we don't even know what we've lost. We're running out of time. Languages are disappearing faster now than at any point in human history. And we're running out of people who remember what these languages sounded like, how they worked, what unique insights they encoded. The clock is running out, and somewhere, someone is watching the last generation of speakers of their language die. They're experiencing the death of an entire way of thinking in real time. Here's a question we don't ask enough. Why did humans invent writing in the first place? It would have been easier not to. Oral tradition worked. Stories could be remembered, passed down, retold, but something drove ancient people to push further. Something made them want to freeze their thoughts permanently. Desperation and ambition were the twin engines. Kings wanted their names to be remembered forever. They didn't want to die and have their civilization forgotten. They carved their accomplishments into stone with the absolute certainty that someday, centuries later, people would read those words and know that they had existed, that they had mattered, that their reign had meant something. It's a fundamentally human impulse, the refusal to disappear completely. But it wasn't just kings. Merchants needed records, and they needed to know how much grain they had traded. They needed to track debts. They needed documentation that would prove what they had given and what they had received. Writing was a technology of power, yes, but it was also a technology of survival. If you could write, you could keep track of things. You could prove your claims. You could win arguments in court. Priests wanted to codify knowledge. Religious truths, they believed, shouldn't be left to the fragility of human memory. They should be written down. They should be preserved. They should be protected from being lost or distorted or forgotten. So priests developed writing systems specifically to preserve spiritual knowledge. And ordinary people, we often forget about them. Ordinary people left messages. We've found love letters carved into clay tablets. We've found curses inscribed in tombs, directed at enemies with the clear expectation that those enemies would somehow read them, understand them, and be harmed by them. We've found children's homework, barely legible scratches on pottery sherds, assignments that never got completed. We've found shopping lists. We've found complaints. People wanted to leave traces of themselves. They wanted to be remembered. What all of this reveals is something we don't think about enough. Ancient people were like us. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their children to know what they thought. They wanted future generations to understand what they had learned. They couldn't record their voices. They couldn't make videos. They couldn't create archives. So they did what they could. They carved words into stone. They pressed them into clay. They painted them onto walls. They did everything in their power to make their voices permanent. The development of writing was one of the most revolutionary moments in human history. It changed how we think. Oral cultures work differently than written cultures. When everything has to be remembered orally, certain things become more important. The ability to memorize, to remember patterns, to connect ideas. Writing changes this. You can now think thoughts that are too complex to memorize. You could develop arguments that would be impossible to keep in your head. You can accumulate knowledge in ways that oral cultures simply cannot. But here's the crucial insight. Ancient people didn't develop writing thinking it would be temporary. They didn't carve their words into stone and think, well, eventually, nobody will be able to read this. They believed their writing systems were eternal. They believed that the symbols they were using would be understood forever. They were so sure of it that they used the same symbols for centuries. They taught their children the symbols. They refined the symbols. They made them more efficient and more sophisticated. They could not have imagined a world where their writing would become completely inaccessible. They could not have imagined a world where scholars would stare at their words, understand that they're meaningful, understand that they contain important information, and still be completely unable to read them. The very permanence they were seeking, the immortality they were carving into stone, became in some cases a permanent imprisonment of their thoughts. If you wanted to freeze a language in time, how would you do it? Different ancient civilizations asked themselves this question and came up with completely different answers. The most intuitive answer is pictures. If you draw an image of the sun, everyone will understand that you're talking about the sun. This is the logic behind pictographs. But pictographs have a problem. They work for concrete things like the sun, or a fish, or a person. But how do you draw an abstract concept like justice, or hope, or tomorrow? You need a more sophisticated system. Egyptian hieroglyphics solve this problem elegantly. They combine pictographs, actual images that represented things, with phonetic symbols. A symbol could represent a picture of an object, or it could represent a sound, and sometimes a symbol could even represent a concept with no pictographic element whatsoever. This system was sophisticated enough to record anything: religious ideas, legal documents, personal letters, administrative records. The Egyptians used hieroglyphics for thousands of years and never abandoned them. They were so committed to this system that they maintained it even as empires changed and new powers conquered Egypt. Cuneiform, developed in Mesopotamia, took a completely different approach. Instead of pictures, cuneiform used wedge shapes, simple lines pressed into clay. These wedges could be arranged in patterns that represented sounds and concepts. Cuneiform is alien to modern eyes. You look at cuneiform and you don't see pictures. You see abstract patterns. But for someone trained in the system, those wedges conveyed meaning with tremendous efficiency. Cuneiform could represent multiple languages. As the Sumerians were conquered by the Akkadians adopted cuneiform and used it to write their own language. Later, the Hittites used cuneiform, the Persians used cuneiform. A single writing system could encode completely different languages. Syllabaries work differently again. Instead of having symbols for individual sounds, a syllabary has symbols for combinations of sounds. The Japanese, hiragana, and katakana systems are modern examples of syllabaries. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, was a syllabary. Each symbol represented a syllable, a combination of a consonant and a vowel, or just a vowel. This system is more economical than a pure pictographic system, but less economical than an alphabet. Alphabets, which eventually developed in the Mediterranean region, are the most efficient system ever created. You have a small set of symbols, maybe 20 or 30, and each symbol represents a single sound. Combine the symbols, and you can write any word in any language. The alphabet is so efficient that it became the standard across most of the world. It's so elegant that we now assume it's the most natural way to write. But alphabets weren't the natural choice for ancient civilizations. They took time to develop. For thousands of years, people used more complex systems. Here's the critical insight. The efficiency of a writing system has nothing to do with how easy it is to decipher. A simple alphabet can be completely illegible if we lose the context for understanding it. Linear B is a syllabary, which makes it more complex than an alphabet, but it was successfully deciphered. Linear A is also a syllabary, but we still can't read it. The difference isn't in the writing system, it's in the evidence that survived and the keys that were left behind. A writing system is only as useful as its survivors, the artifacts that remain, the examples that weren't destroyed, the bilingual texts that might give us a translation key, the context clues that might help us understand what the symbols mean. Egyptian hieroglyphics could have remained a complete mystery forever. We know how to read them because of a single artifact, a black stone that happened to contain the same text in 3 different scripts. Without that stone, Egyptian might still be incomprehensible. This is where luck enters the equation. An ancient scribe's effort, intelligence, and intention matter, but whether we can read them thousands of years later depends on whether the right artifacts survived, whether someone, somewhere, left us a key, whether the universe happened to preserve the one piece of evidence that would unlock everything else. In 1799, French soldiers in Egypt discovered a black granite stone. It was impressive, certainly, carved from dense stone and covered in writing. But to the soldiers, it was just another artifact among many. It was photographed, it was sketched, it was packed onto a ship heading back to Europe. Nobody on that ship had any idea that they were transporting the skeleton key to 3,000 years of human history. The Rosetta Stone, as it came to be known, is a translation key. On its surface are 3 versions of the same text, one written in hieroglyphics, one in a more cursive script called demotic, and one in Greek. Greek was a known language. Scholars in Europe could read Greek fluently. Here, finally, was a chance to use what they could read to understand what they couldn't. But possessing a translation key and knowing how to use it are 2 different things. For decades, the Rosetta Stone sat in European museums, tantalizing scholars who stared at it and couldn't figure out how to unlock it. The Greek text explained that this was a decree issued by Ptolemy V, but that didn't immediately tell scholars how the hieroglyphics worked. Did the hieroglyphics represent words directly? Did they represent sounds? Did they work like pictures or like an abstract system? Multiple competing theories existed. Scholars argued furiously. Some believed hieroglyphics were purely symbolic. Others believed they were purely phonetic. Nobody could agree, and the stone, despite its potential, remained locked. The Rosetta Stone wasn't unique, though. Other civilizations left similar keys. The Behistun inscription, carved high on a cliff face in what is now Iran, contains the same text in 3 languages. That inscription told the story of the Persian king Darius I and became another crucial decipherment key. The Mycenaean Linear B tablets found at Knossos in Crete included lists and inventories with numbers attached, allowing scholars to use context to figure out what the numbers meant. The clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia provided thousands of examples of cuneiform writing. Enough examples that patterns could be identified, enough evidence that decipherment became possible. But here's the sobering truth. For every artifact that survived with a key, there are countless others that survived without one. Linear A is an example. We have hundreds of Linear A texts. We know their writing. We know they represent a language. We know from the context that they recorded administrative and religious information. But we have no bilingual text. We have no Rosetta Stone for Linear A. We have no translation key. And without that key, despite all our effort and ingenuity, the script remains essentially closed. The Indus Valley script presents an even more frustrating mystery. The Indus Valley civilization was as large as Egypt or Mesopotamia combined. They had sophisticated cities. They had a complete writing system. We have thousands of examples of their writing on seals and pottery. But they left us no Rosetta Stone. We don't have a bilingual text. We don't have enough examples of any particular phrase to identify patterns with certainty. We don't even know for certain if the script represents language or if it serves some other purpose entirely. So the writing is right there, visible, studied by some of the best minds in archaeology and linguistics, and we still cannot read it. Rongorongo, the script of Easter Island, represents perhaps the most enigmatic mystery. These symbols are carved into wooden tablets. They're clearly deliberate. They're clearly meaningful. But scholars debate whether they even constitute writing at all. Maybe they're decorative. Maybe they're musical notation. Maybe they're a writing system that was never fully developed. The tablets survived, the mysteries survived, but the meaning didn't. This is the pattern. Survival alone isn't enough. You need the right evidence. You need the key. You need the piece of the puzzle that fits with all the others. The difference between a deciphered script and an eternally mysterious script isn't the intelligence of ancient people. It isn't the sophistication of the writing system. It's the luck of what survived and what was lost. It's whether someone left us a key and whether that key made it through 300 or 3,000 years intact. War brought Egypt's secrets to Europe. Napoleon, convinced that controlling Egypt would secure French power in the Mediterranean, launched an expedition in 1798. He brought soldiers, yes, but also scientists. He brought engineers and archaeologists and scholars. He wanted to understand Egypt while also conquering it. And while his soldiers marched across deserts and fought battles, one remarkable artifact made its way into French hands, though nobody realized yet that it was remarkable. The stone was found near the town of Rosetta in the Delta region where the Nile meets the Mediterranean. It was massive, carved from black granite, heavy enough that moving it required serious effort. It had clearly been broken at some point. The top was missing. But what remained was intact. 3 languages carved into its surface. 3 versions of the same text, presumably 3 chances to unlock a mystery. The soldiers didn't understand its significance. How could they? They were fighting a war. They were occupying a country. An interesting artifact, covered in strange writing, was just that. An interesting artifact. It got transported back to Europe, and there it went into a collection, one treasure among many from the conquest. But back in Europe, something extraordinary was happening. Scholars were starting to become obsessed with this stone. They could read the Greek portion, the bottommost text, and that Greek portion made something clear. This was a decree issued by Egyptian priests in honor of Ptolemy V Epiphanes. The stone was a religious monument that served a political purpose. But the crucial information was this: the text at the top must be the same message written in hieroglyphics, and the text in the middle must be the same message written in demotic, a more cursive form of Egyptian writing used in everyday administrative contexts. Here finally was a translation, or seemed to be. Scholars now had Greek on one side and hieroglyphics on the other. Surely this was enough to unlock the mystery. Surely this was the key, but it wasn't that simple. Possessing a translation and understanding how to use it are two entirely different things. The Greek text described rituals and honors and religious concepts. But when scholars tried to match the Greek words to the hieroglyphic symbols, nothing made sense, nothing aligned, nothing connected in any obvious way. The hieroglyphics could represent pictures, or they could represent sounds, or they could represent some combination of both. Without understanding the logic of the system, a translation meant nothing. The early years of Rosetta Stone study were filled with wild hypotheses. Some scholars believed that the entire hieroglyphic script was purely symbolic, that each symbol represented a complete concept or word with no phonetic element whatsoever. This made the translation problem infinitely harder. If each symbol was a picture of an idea rather than a representation of a sound, then matching symbols to Greek words would be nearly impossible. Other scholars believed that the script was purely phonetic, but couldn't figure out which sounds went with which symbols. The competitive atmosphere in early 19th century European scholarship made matters worse. Instead, multiple scholars worked on the problem simultaneously, each afraid that someone else would publish a breakthrough first. Some scholars shared their findings reluctantly or not at all. Others published partial translations that were more speculation than scholarship. The race to decipher the Rosetta Stone became a race for glory and academic reputation. The stone sat in the British Museum, a public object that anyone could study, and yet it remained locked away by the very problem it was supposed to solve. England held the stone after the British defeated the French. France, understandably, wanted it back, but the British refused to return it. It became a trophy of conquest in more ways than one, a prize that one empire stole from another, which now contained the secrets of a third, much older empire. The irony was profound. The tool that could unlock ancient Egypt was locked in a museum in London, studied by scholars from across Europe, and still nobody could figure out how to use it. Decades passed. The puzzle remained unsolved. The stone sat in its display case, mocking scholars with its proximity to revelation. Someone, somewhere, would eventually figure it out, but that person would have to possess a particular kind of genius. They would have to be able to see patterns that others missed. They would have to be willing to challenge the assumptions that everyone else accepted. Jean-François Champollion was born in 1790 in a small town in southern France. From his earliest childhood, he demonstrated an extraordinary talent for languages. He could pick up new languages with remarkable speed. By his teenage years, he was fluent in a dozen languages, some spoken, some dead. His mind worked in a particular way. While other people saw chaos in a foreign language, Champollion saw patterns. He saw connections. He could sense when grammar was working in a particular way, even if he didn't consciously understand it yet. His teachers recognized his talent immediately. They pushed him to study ancient languages. He became obsessed with ancient civilizations. He read everything written in ancient Greek. He studied Latin with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He taught himself Coptic, in a language descended from ancient Egyptian. He was driven by a burning desire to understand the ancient world, to hear the voices of long-dead civilizations, to reconstruct their thoughts. But for years, the Rosetta Stone problem seemed impossible. Everyone agreed on that. The scholars who had worked on it for decades had failed. It seemed like one of those problems that simply didn't have a solution. The evidence was there, but the key remained missing. The translation was there, but the logic of the hieroglyphic system remained mysterious. Champollion was different from the other scholars working on the problem. He was younger, he was more willing to question basic assumptions. And crucially, he had an advantage that many others didn't. He spoke Coptic. And Coptic was the language spoken by Coptic Christians in Egypt, a descendant of ancient Egyptian, though modified by centuries of Greek and Arabic influence. But the grammar was still there. The underlying structure was preserved. Champollion understood that if he could find the connection between Coptic and the hieroglyphics on the Rosetta Stone, he might be able to unlock the entire system. The breakthrough came in 1822, and it was elegant in its simplicity. Champollion was examining the Rosetta Stone and noticed something that others had overlooked. The name Ptolemy was written phonetically in the hieroglyphic text. The symbols didn't represent the concept of king or the idea of royal. They represented the sounds that made up the word Ptolemy, Ptolmy. Each symbol was a sound. The key to the entire system had been hidden in plain sight. This insight changed everything. If proper names were written phonetically, then other words might be too. And if other words were written phonetically, then the entire script could potentially be read as a phonetic system combined with symbolic elements. Champollion began testing this hypothesis systematically. He matched symbols from the Rosetta Stone to sounds in Coptic. He looked for patterns. He developed theories about how the system worked. Other scholars had been close to this insight, but Champollion was the one who had the courage to commit to it completely. He pushed further. He studied more texts. He compared multiple examples. He refined his understanding. And gradually, the ancient language began to speak. Words began to form that made linguistic sense, and concepts began to connect. His colleagues at first dismissed his work. They thought he was making wild guesses. They thought he was seeing patterns that weren't really there. But Champollion persisted. He was obsessive. He was meticulous. He was unwilling to accept that the problem was unsolvable. And he was right. By 1822, he had proven conclusively that Egyptian hieroglyphics could be read, that they combined phonetic and symbolic elements, and that the ancient Egyptian language, a completely different language from any spoken in Europe, could be reconstructed and understood. Champollion didn't have better tools than his rivals. He didn't have access to evidence they didn't have. He had something different. He had a mind that worked in a particular way. He could see the pattern where others saw chaos. He could make the leap that others couldn't make. And he had the determination to pursue an idea that everyone else had abandoned as unsolvable. The irony is that Champollion died relatively young in 1832, before he could see the full flowering of Egyptian studies that his breakthrough made possible. He didn't live to see how his work would inspire other scholars to decipher other ancient scripts. He didn't live to see the ancient world speak in all its complexity and contradiction and humanity. But his breakthrough did something almost sacred. It proved that the past could be recovered, that the dead could speak again, that time itself was not an absolute barrier to human understanding. The moment Champollion proved that Egyptian hieroglyphics could be read, the entire history of human civilization reorganized itself. Suddenly, Egypt was no longer a collection of mysterious monuments and incomprehensible symbols. It was a civilization with a voice. It had laws. It had literature. It had complaints and prayers and love letters. It had political debates. It had people who argued with each other and wrote down their arguments. It had scribes who made jokes. It had children who attended school and presumably didn't want to be there. But more than that, Champollion's breakthrough proved something fundamental. Ancient languages were recoverable. The proof of concept was established. If Egyptian could be cracked, perhaps other scripts could be too. Perhaps Linear B could be deciphered. Perhaps cuneiform could yield its secrets. The successful decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics essentially proved that no ancient language was permanently locked away. With enough evidence, enough patience, enough brilliant observation, the barriers between us and the ancient world could be crossed. Within years of Champollion's breakthrough, archaeologists and scholars were racing to study Egypt's recovered texts. Temples that had stood silent for millennia suddenly began to speak. The Egyptians had recorded their own history extensively. They had written about their wars, their victories, their defeats. They had written about the gods and the afterlife. They had recorded laws and administrative procedures. They had written personal letters to friends and family. The volume of recovered text was staggering. Rameses II, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, had his correspondence preserved. His letters reveal him as a military strategist, a political negotiator, someone constantly dealing with the complexities of ruling an empire. His messages to other rulers, to the Hittites, to other neighboring states, show us that the ancient world was already interconnected. There were alliances and conflicts and negotiations happening between civilizations that we had thought of as isolated from each other. The Tale of Sinuhe, a literary work preserved in multiple copies, tells the story of an official who flees Egypt, lives abroad, and eventually returns home. It's a work of genuine literary sophistication. It has themes of exile and belonging and national identity. It's a story that people still find meaningful today, and we would never have known it existed if we couldn't read Egyptian. The entire tradition of Egyptian literature, the fact that they even had literature at all, would have remained hidden from us. Religious texts decoded from temple walls revealed that Egyptian theology was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. They had multiple gods with contradictory characteristics. They had philosophical questions about the nature of death and the afterlife. They had spiritual practices that combined what we might call magic with what we might call practical knowledge. The categories that modern scholars use don't map cleanly onto Egyptian thinking. They thought differently. They organized their understanding of the world in ways that don't fit neatly into modern categories. Medical texts revealed that the Egyptians understood anatomy, and they performed surgeries. They had treatments for diseases. Some of these treatments worked, others didn't. But the framework for understanding medicine wasn't purely practical. It was integrated with spiritual beliefs. A disease wasn't just a physical problem. It was a spiritual imbalance that needed to be addressed spiritually as well as physically. Modern medicine has largely separated these concerns, but the Egyptians kept them together. We can see their approach as primitive, or we can see it as different, a different framework for understanding a complex problem. But here's what's crucial. Understanding that we can read Egyptian doesn't mean we fully understand Egyptian. Translation is not simple access. When we translate Egyptian into English, we're making choices. We're choosing which meaning of a word to emphasize, or we're choosing how to interpret ambiguous phrases. Sometimes the original meaning is lost in translation. Sometimes meanings shift. Sometimes we encounter concepts for which we have no exact equivalents. The Egyptians, separated from us by thousands of years in a completely different cultural context, understood the world in ways that are partially alien to us. We can learn from their texts, but we cannot assume we fully understand them. The voices from the past are not fully transparent. They speak to us across a gulf of time and culture, and we listen as carefully as we can, but full understanding, perfect comprehension might be forever beyond our reach. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the point isn't to understand them completely, but to honor their attempt to reach across time to us, and to listen as carefully as we possibly can. A detective arrives at a crime scene knowing that a crime has been committed. The victim is present, or the evidence of the crime is present. The detective must reconstruct what happened using fragments: a fingerprint, a bloodstain, a witness's testimony. The detective makes hypotheses. The detective tests these hypotheses. When a hypothesis is confirmed, it becomes stronger. When it fails, the detective moves on to another theory. A linguistic detective, approaching an undeciphered script, faces a similar situation. They know that the script represents meaningful communication. The evidence is in front of them, but they don't know the language. They don't know the sounds it represents. They don't know the grammar. They have to reconstruct everything using fragments and patterns. The tools a linguistic detective uses are surprisingly elegant. Frequency analysis is one of them. The detective counts how often each symbol appears in a text. The assumption is that certain symbols will appear very frequently. The common words, the particles that hold sentences together. The detective assumes that in any language, certain words are used more often than others. So if a symbol appears in 50% of the texts examined, it's probably representing something very common. Maybe it's a conjunction, maybe it's a preposition, maybe it's a definite article. The detective builds a hypothesis based on frequency. Comparative analysis is another tool. The detective looks at multiple texts and tries to identify repetition. if the same sequence of symbols appears again and again in specific contexts, that might be a clue. Maybe it's a title. Maybe it's a name. Maybe it's a common phrase. The detective assumes that patterns in the data are meaningful. Contextual clues are crucial. If a symbol appears above a name, it probably indicates something about that name. A title, a descriptor, a professional designation. If a symbol appears next to a number, it might be labeling what that number refers to. If a symbol appears at the beginning of every text in a specific category, it might be a header or a label that marks the text's function. The decipherment of Linear B, achieved by Michael Ventris in 1952, demonstrates these methods perfectly. Ventris was an architect, not a professional linguist, but he had a passion for ancient languages. He began by collecting every known example of Linear B script. He created frequency tables. He noted which symbols appeared most often. He hypothesized about what the most common symbols might represent, based on the assumption that all languages have common features. Most crucially, Ventris was willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions that other scholars had accepted. Everyone believed that Linear B was a non-Indo-European language, something completely alien to anything in the Mediterranean world. But Ventris began to wonder, what if it was Greek? What if this was an early form of Greek, written in a syllabary? The hypothesis seemed radical. Nobody else had suggested it, but Ventris couldn't shake the idea. He tested it methodically. He assigned phonetic values to the symbols. He looked for patterns that would emerge if the language were Greek. He examined the endings of words to see if they followed patterns that would make sense in Greek grammar. And gradually, impossibly, words began to form. Words that made linguistic sense. Words that followed grammatical rules that linguists recognized. The emotional experience of this kind of work is hard to convey. It's months of frustration, of dead ends, of hypotheses that fail. It's the experience of being absolutely certain that you're close and completely unable to see the answer. And then, suddenly, clarity. The pattern emerges. The chaos resolves into order. A language that had been silent for 3,000 years suddenly becomes readable. This is what linguistic detective work is. It's not magic. It's not a sudden flash of genius. It's careful observation combined with creative hypothesis making. It's being willing to question assumptions. It's having the discipline to test theories rigorously. And it's having the persistence to keep working, even when everyone else tells you that the problem is unsolvable. The linguist becomes a detective, and the ancient script becomes a crime scene. The mystery is waiting to be solved. The question is whether anyone is patient and brilliant enough to crack it. Michael Ventris was born in 1922. As a child, he saw a publication by Sir Arthur Evans about the Menon civilization and the mysterious Linear B script. Something about those undeciphered symbols captivated him. He was maybe 12 years old. He couldn't have explained why he cared so much, but the mystery of Linear B became something like an obsession for him. He decided right then, as a 12-year-old boy, that he was going to solve it. That decision shaped the rest of his life. Ventris became an architect professionally. He had a career, he had a family, he had obligations and responsibilities, but underneath everything, he never stopped thinking about Linear B. He came back to it again and again in his spare time, working alone, testing hypotheses, comparing texts. The work was slow and frustrating. A Ventris would make progress on one theory and then discover that it didn't hold up when tested against other texts. He would feel certain that he understood something, only to encounter a contradiction that shattered his understanding. For decades, this pattern repeated. He worked, he failed, he adjusted his approach, he failed again. But Ventris had a crucial advantage. He was willing to question the fundamental assumptions that other scholars had made. Everyone accepted that Linear B was probably a non-Indo-European language. It made sense. The Minoans were not Greek, so why would their language be Greek? The logic seemed obvious, but Ventris couldn't help wondering, what if everyone was wrong? In 1952, something shifted. Ventris was examining the Linear B texts, looking at the patterns in the symbols, and he noticed something that seems obvious once you see it, but which nobody else had observed. The symbols at the beginning of what he believed were place names followed a consistent pattern. The same symbols appeared repeatedly in the same positions. These patterns were consistent with inflectional endings in languages Ventris understood. They were consistent with the way Greek grammar works. The insight was that Linear B might be Greek, not some other language, not some unknown tongue that had disappeared from the world, but Greek, the language that would eventually give rise to classical Greece, to philosophy, to the Western intellectual tradition. Greek written in a syllabary instead of an alphabet, but Greek nonetheless. Ventris tested this hypothesis systematically. He assigned phonetic values to the symbols based on the assumption that they represented Greek sounds. He worked through the texts, trying to decode them, looking for words that would make sense, and impossibly, words began to emerge. He would decode a phrase and find that it was comprehensible Greek, not perfectly clear. Some parts were still ambiguous, but recognizable as a language. The moment when this became undeniable was when Ventris decoded a phrase that appeared in multiple texts: tupo, tupo, ko, tuna, ko, tune. When he applied the phonetic values he had hypothesized, this decoded to something like tripod, one of tripods, an administrative record about tripods. The fact that this made perfect linguistic sense, that it fit the grammatical patterns of Greek, that it would be a perfectly sensible thing to appear in an administrative record. All of this was too much to be coincidence. Within months, scholars around the world confirmed Ventris's work. His breakthrough was real. Linear B could be read, and when it could be read, an entire lost civilization, the Mycenaean Greeks, suddenly became visible to us. We learned about their palaces and their trade networks and their military campaigns. We found records of wars and peace treaties. We found inventories of goods and lists of titles. We found, recorded in an ancient script, the real history of the people who had inspired Homer's legends thousands of years later. But the moment of reading words that made sense was transformative for more reasons than just the academic success. It proved that Ventris was right. It proved that the mystery could be solved. It proved that a problem that had seemed unsolvable for centuries could yield to patient, brilliant, determined work. And it proved that the ancient world, no matter how distant, no matter how lost, could still speak to us if we were patient enough to listen. Reading a script and understanding it are two different things. Ventris proved that Linear B could be read. He showed that the symbols represented Greek sounds. He demonstrated that ancient Mycenaean Greek could be reconstructed from the texts. But understanding what the texts actually meant, really understanding them in all their complexity, turned out to be a different and ongoing challenge. The Linear B texts are primarily administrative records, inventory lists, accounting records, tallies of goods received and distributed. These are not the most emotionally compelling texts. They're not poetry or philosophy or personal letters. They're bureaucratic documents. A scribe sitting in a palace, recording how many jars of olive oil were received, how many weapons were in the armory, how many workers were assigned to specific tasks. But these mundane texts are precisely what make Linear B so valuable. Historians and archaeologists want to understand daily life. They want to know what people actually did, what they valued, how they organized their society. A love letter tells us about romance. A religious text tells us about spiritual belief. But an inventory list tells us about the economic foundation of a civilization. It tells us what was important enough to count and record. When Ventris's decipherment was confirmed, scholars began working through the text systematically, trying to interpret what each one meant, and immediately they encountered complications. Translation is not simple access to meaning. A word in ancient Mycenaean Greek might be grammatically clear. Scholars could identify it as a noun or a verb, but its exact meaning might remain ambiguous. Did a particular term refer to a type of worker, a type of good, an animal? Without sufficient context, sometimes it's impossible to know for certain. One famous example, Linear B texts mention women being distributed. The word is clear, the grammar is clear. But what does it mean? Are these women captives, refugees, enslaved people being sold, dancers being assigned to a festival? The text itself doesn't make the context entirely clear. Scholars have debated this for decades, and we may never know the definitive answer. More broadly, understanding Linear B requires understanding not just the language, but the culture that produced it. The Mycenaean Greeks were separated from us by 3,000 years and a completely different cultural context. They had different assumptions about how society should be organized. They had different values. They understood the world differently. When we read their words, we're not just translating sounds and grammar. We're trying to bridge a cultural gulf that might be impossible to fully cross. The complexity is even deeper when we consider that the scribes who wrote Linear B were probably not native speakers. They were trained in a bureaucratic system. They wrote in a formal, official language that might have differed significantly from everyday speech. We're reading not conversational Mycenaean Greek, but administrative Mycenaean Greek. We're seeing the language as it was written by professionals in a specific context, not as it was spoken in homes and marketplaces. This is why decipherment is not solution, but beginning. We can read Linear B now. We can understand the basic meaning of the texts, but full comprehension, understanding not just what words mean, but why they matter, what assumptions underlie them, how the people who wrote them thought about the world that remains partially beyond our reach. The voices from the past speak to us, but across a gulf of time and culture that we can narrow but perhaps never completely close. When Egyptian hieroglyphics were finally decoded, something remarkable happened. Egypt stopped being a mystery and started being a place, not a collection of monuments and artifacts, but an actual civilization where actual people lived and thought and argued. The moment you can read the language of a civilization, that civilization becomes three-dimensional. It becomes human. We find texts of an Egyptian mother worried about her son's education. The writing is thousands of years old, but the sentiment is immediately recognizable. A parent concerned that their child isn't applying themselves to learning, worrying about their future. We find texts of a worker complaining about his rations. He's not getting paid enough. He's frustrated, he's angry, and he writes it down in a complaint to his supervisor, probably knowing that this complaint will achieve nothing, but needing to document his grievance anyway. We find jokes written by scribes in the margins of official documents, jokes that probably made other scribes laugh 3,000 years ago. The genius of studying deciphered texts is that it allows us to recognize ancient people as individuals with thoughts and emotions that resonate across millennia. An Egyptian mathematician working on a geometry problem, trying to solve it, scratching out wrong answers and trying again. An Egyptian scribe signing their name to a document, wanting to be remembered, wanting people to know that they existed and that they had produced this work. A child's hand, still learning to write, pressing symbols into clay with uncertain pressure. But there's something deeper happening when we read Egyptian. We're accessing a completely different way of thinking. The Egyptian language structured concepts differently than our languages do. The Egyptians had multiple words for concepts that we express with a single word. They made distinctions we don't make, and didn't make distinctions that we consider important. The way a language categorizes experience shapes how the people who speak that language think about the world. Egyptian temporal concepts don't map cleanly onto our present-past-future framework. The Egyptians seemed to conceptualize time differently. They understood causation differently. They had ways of expressing certainty and doubt that don't correspond to how English handles modality. When you read Egyptian, you're not just learning new words, you're encountering a different way of organizing knowledge about the world. Their approach to the physical world emphasized relationships and connections rather than isolated objects. An Egyptian text describing a scene in a temple might not follow our spatial logic. The painter and the writer both worked with a different sense of what was important to record. They emphasized symbolic relationships and meaningful connections rather than literal spatial accuracy. What mattered was not the actual visual arrangement of things, but the conceptual connections between them. The Egyptian approach to religion reveals a civilization that could tolerate contradictions in ways that modern Western logic finds uncomfortable. They had multiple creation myths. They had gods with contradictory characteristics. They seemed to be entirely comfortable with the idea that different stories might be true in different contexts, or that different aspects of a god might be emphasized in different situations. A god could be both male and female. A god could be both a specific being and a universal force. Modern logic would see these as contradictions. Egyptian thinking seemed to see them as complementary perspectives on a larger truth. Medical texts reveal that the Egyptians observed symptoms documented treatments, and noted what worked and what didn't. They understood anatomy to a remarkable degree. Some of their medical treatments were effective, others were not. But what's remarkable is that they combined this practical observation with spiritual understanding. A disease was both a physical problem and a spiritual imbalance. Healing required both practical treatment and spiritual intervention. We've separated these concerns in modern medicine, but that doesn't mean the Egyptian way was wrong. It means it was different. Different doesn't mean primitive. The most beautiful aspect of reading Egyptian texts is that it allows us to see that ancient people were fundamentally like us. They wanted to leave traces of themselves. They wanted to be remembered. A scribe signing a document isn't that different from a modern person signing their work. A parent worried about their child's education isn't that different from a modern parent. A worker complaining about his wages isn't that different from a modern worker. The basic human emotions, love, fear, ambition, frustration, hope, these transcend millennia, are the voices from ancient Egypt speak to us across thousands of years. And when we listen, we realize that these weren't fundamentally alien beings. They were people, and their way of thinking, while different from ours, was sophisticated, complex, and meaningful. They left us messages, and by learning to read them, we expand our understanding of what humans are capable of thinking. What did ancient civilizations know that we've forgotten? This question haunts us as we read the recovered texts from the ancient world. Not everything ancient people believed is correct by modern standards. They got some things wrong. But the fact that they solved the problems they faced in completely different ways suggests that human innovation is far from exhausted. Egyptian mathematics operated within different constraints than Greek mathematics, but it was no less sophisticated. The Egyptians developed algebraic thinking, solving problems by setting up equations and working toward a solution. They understood geometry deeply enough to build structures like the pyramids that still perplex modern engineers. Their approach was different from the approaches later developed by Greek mathematicians, but it was effective. They solved the problems they needed to solve. The same is true of Egyptian medicine. The Egyptians couldn't have antibiotics. They couldn't have surgery as we know it. But they observed carefully. They documented what worked and what didn't. They developed treatments that, while not perfect, were effective in many cases. Some of their medical knowledge was combined with spiritual belief, with the assumption that illness had spiritual causes. We would separate those concerns now, but we might be wrong to dismiss their approach. Maybe approaching illness from a holistic perspective, physical, spiritual, psychological, offers insights that a purely materialistic medicine might miss. Egyptian architecture reveals sophisticated mathematical knowledge combined with spiritual understanding. The pyramids are geometric perfection, but they are also spiritual monuments. The proportions encode mathematical relationships that the Egyptians believed to be sacred. The fact that we can analyze the pyramids mathematically now doesn't mean the Egyptians weren't also thinking mathematically when they designed them. The combination of practical engineering knowledge and spiritual significance might have enhanced rather than detracted from their achievement. But perhaps most importantly, The Egyptian approach to writing itself offers us a perspective we've largely lost. The Egyptians treated writing as a sacred act. They believed that writing had power. By writing your name, you ensured your immortality. By writing your story, you preserved it. Writing wasn't just a neutral technology for storing information. It was a technology with transformative power. It could preserve identity. It could transcend death. This perspective has mostly disappeared from modern thinking. We see writing as merely informational. But the Egyptians understood something that we might have lost, that the act of writing, of preserving words, of creating a permanent record of thought, is fundamentally sacred. Similarly, when we look at the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations that invented cuneiform, we find evidence of sophisticated mathematical thinking. The Babylonians were solving algebraic problems. They were working with the Pythagorean theorem. They were developing astronomy that was remarkably accurate. They were documenting their knowledge in a way that allowed it to be preserved and transmitted. The fact that their civilization eventually fell and their knowledge was lost for millennia doesn't make their achievements less remarkable. The deeper question is this: if ancient civilizations solved problems differently than we do, what does that tell us about human possibility? What does it tell us about the flexibility of the human mind? The fact that multiple civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently developed writing systems suggests that humans are capable of this innovation. The fact that they developed it in completely different ways suggests that there's no single correct way to solve this problem. This has implications for how we think about modern challenges. We tend to assume that there's one correct way to approach problems. But ancient civilizations approached them differently and sometimes succeeded. Their approaches were adapted to their specific contexts, to their environment, their resources, their cultural values. In our attempts to solve modern problems, we might benefit from looking at how other cultures, other times, have approached similar challenges. The loss of ancient languages is therefore not just the loss of information, it's the loss of different problem-solving approaches. It's the loss of different ways of thinking about the world. When a language dies, a way of thinking dies, and we lose potential resources for addressing our current challenges. Maybe an Australian Aboriginal language encoded knowledge about sustainable relationships with land that we desperately need in the age of climate change. Maybe an Andean language encoded mathematical principles that we haven't rediscovered. Maybe a now extinct Mesopotamian language preserved medical knowledge that could help us. We'll never know, because those languages are gone. Standing in a museum, looking at Linear A texts, you face a particular kind of frustration. You know you're looking at writing. It's clearly intentional. It's clearly meaningful. Someone took time to carve these symbols. Someone believed they mattered. And yet, you cannot read a single word. Linear A is the predecessor to Linear B. It was used by the Minoan civilization for administrative and religious purposes. There are hundreds of examples of Linear A texts. They appear on pottery, they appear on sacred objects, they appear in palatial contexts. Scholars have studied them intensely for decades, and yet the script remains almost entirely undeciphered. The frustration comes from the fact that we know so much, and yet so little. We can see that Linear A is a writing system. We can see that different texts serve different purposes based on context. We can hypothesize about what kinds of information were being recorded, but we cannot read the actual words. We cannot understand the actual meanings. We're locked outside, pressing our faces against the glass, able to see that there's a room full of information inside, but unable to find the door. Why is Linear A so difficult to decipher when Linear B was cracked? The primary reason is that we lack the crucial artifact, the Rosetta Stone. We have no bilingual text that would give us a translation key. We have no text in Linear A that's accompanied by a translation in a language we understand. Without that key, pattern recognition alone isn't sufficient. We can notice that certain symbols appear frequently, but we can't be certain what they mean. We can see repetitions, but we can't be certain what they represent. The Indus Valley script presents an even more profound mystery. The Indus Valley civilization was as large as Egypt or Mesopotamia combined. They had cities with sophisticated planning and sanitation systems. They had writing. They had a complete script that appeared on seals and pottery and tablets. We have thousands of examples of Indus Valley script. We've studied it intensely. We've applied computer analysis to it. We've tried everything, and yet we still cannot decipher it. We don't even know for certain that it represents language. It might be writing, it might be decorative, it might be symbolic in ways that aren't linguistic at all. The mystery is compounded by the fact that the Indus Valley civilization seems to have been abandoned or to have undergone some kind of transformation around 1900 BCE. The script disappears from the archaeological record. We never find any evidence that it was used in a transitional form or adapted into another script. It simply vanishes. Rongorongo, the script of Easter Island, represents a different kind of mystery. The wooden tablets covered in these symbols are remarkable artifacts. They were carved with precision. They're clearly intentional. But scholars debate whether they even constitute writing. Maybe they're musical notation. Maybe they're decorative. Maybe they're a proto-writing system that never fully developed. We have only a handful of tablets preserved. The context for understanding them is almost entirely lost. In the most sobering reality is this: we might never decipher some of these scripts. Linear A might remain locked forever. The Indus Valley script might never yield its secrets. Rongorongo might remain enigmatic. And the problem isn't that these ancient people weren't skilled writers or didn't have anything important to say. The problem is that we lack the crucial pieces of the puzzle. We lack the keys. We lack the bilingual texts, or the sufficient evidence, or the right approach that would unlock them. These undeciphered scripts represent the limit of our ability to recover the past. They remind us that historical understanding is fragmented. They remind us that some knowledge, once lost, might be permanently inaccessible. They humble us, and they call to us, demanding that we continue trying, continue studying, continue hoping that someday someone will notice the pattern that unlocks everything. Imagine a law that says your language is illegal in schools. Your children are punished for speaking it. Books written in your language are burned. The dominant power tells you explicitly and repeatedly that your language is primitive, backward, uncivilized. Your language is inferior. Your way of thinking is inferior. Your entire cultural tradition is worthless. This wasn't hypothetical. This happened to millions of people. It's still happening. The Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica provides the starkest historical example. When the conquistadors arrived, the Maya civilization had already declined from its classic period heights, but it was still vibrant. There were still Maya states. There was still a sophisticated culture. There was still a writing system that preserved knowledge, history, philosophy, spiritual understanding. The Franciscan friars who came with the Spanish looked at Mayan codices and saw evil. They saw heresy. They saw the work of demons, and they burned them. Systematically and deliberately, they destroyed the written record of Mayan civilization. The friars didn't understand Mayan writing, but they were certain that it represented dangerous ideas. So they burned the books. The scale of this destruction is hard to comprehend. Thousands of codices, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge, went into the flames. Most of Mayan literature, most of Mayan history, most of Mayan scientific and spiritual knowledge was destroyed. Only 4 codices survived, hidden, preserved in secret by people who understood what was being lost and risked their lives to save these fragile documents. The psychological impact of this destruction on Maya people must have been devastating. Your entire written tradition is being erased. Your language is being forbidden. Your way of thinking is being declared worthless. The message is clear. You are inferior. Your civilization is inferior. Your way of understanding the world is inferior. There's only one way to be civilized, and it's the Spanish way. But it wasn't just Spain and Mesoamerica. The suppression of language happened wherever empires encountered people who spoke different languages. The English suppressed Celtic languages in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Colonial powers around the world suppressed indigenous languages in favor of the colonizers' language. The process was systematic and deliberate. Language death in colonial contexts rarely happened suddenly. It happened through gradual pressure. Education in schools was conducted in the dominant language. Economic opportunity required speaking the dominant language. Government, law, and commerce all used the dominant language. Young people learned that speaking their native language limited their opportunities. Parents, wanting their children to succeed, made the painful decision to stop teaching them the native language. Within 1 or 2 generations, the language was gone, and often this wasn't portrayed as loss. It was portrayed as progress, as modernization. Indigenous people were told that their languages were holding them back, that letting go of their languages was necessary for development, that adopting the dominant language was enlightened and progressive. The framing made the loss seem like evolution, like natural development, rather than what it actually was, cultural destruction imposed by powerful forces. But sometimes it was even more deliberate. The Dalmatian language, a Romance language spoken on the Dalmatian coast, declined as Italian became the language of education, commerce, and prestige. By the late 19th century, only a handful of speakers remained. By 1898, there was only one native speaker left, an old man named Tuoni Udaina. When he died, the language died with him. Entirely, completely. A Romance language that had its own unique features, its own way of organizing grammar and meaning, was lost forever. The Tasmanian languages were even more devastated. The Aboriginal people of Tasmania had their own languages, their own ways of thinking and speaking, but the colonization process, combined with disease and violence, nearly wiped out the entire Tasmanian Aboriginal population. The languages went with them. By the early 20th century, the last native speakers of Tasmanian languages were gone. These weren't accidental losses. These were the results of policies, attitudes, and power structures that devalued non-dominant languages. This wasn't the natural evolution of language. This was linguistic violence, the killing of languages through suppression and cultural destruction. And the tragic part is that the people being harmed usually understood what was happening. They knew that their languages were dying. They mourned it. But they were caught in structures of power that made it almost impossible to resist the tide. When economic opportunity requires abandoning your language, when your children will be punished in school for speaking your language, when the entire society is telling you that your language is worthless, how do you resist? How do you keep your language alive when the system is actively trying to kill it? But there are stories of resistance, stories of communities that fought back against linguistic death, and sometimes, against the odds, they succeeded. Hebrew is perhaps the most remarkable example. By the Common Era, Hebrew had become primarily a liturgical language and a written language for scholars. It was the language of prayer in Jewish communities, and it was the language of Torah study. But as a living, everyday spoken language, it was mostly dead. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Middle East. Greek was the language of commerce and education. Arabic would later become the dominant language. But Hebrew, the language of ancient Israel, had transformed from a language spoken by millions to a language spoken by practically nobody. Yet in the 19th and 20th centuries, Hebrew was revived, not through accident, not through natural linguistic evolution, but through deliberate, sustained effort. Jewish communities, particularly in Palestine, made a conscious choice to revive Hebrew as a living language. It would become the language of education. It would become the language of literature and newspapers. It would become the language of daily life. Eliezer ben Yehuda is often credited as the primary architect of modern Hebrew. Ben Yehuda learned Hebrew from texts. He moved to Palestine and deliberately raised his children speaking only Hebrew at home. This was radical. Everyone around them spoke Arabic and other languages, but Ben Yehuda was determined. He wanted his children to be native speakers of Hebrew. He wanted to prove that Hebrew could be a living language again, and it worked. His children grew up speaking Hebrew fluently. They had Hebrew as their native language, making them some of the first native speakers of modern Hebrew in nearly 2,000 years. From that beginning, Hebrew spread. Schools were established where instruction was conducted in Hebrew. A newspaper in Hebrew was founded. Literature was written in Hebrew. Hebrew gradually became the dominant language of Jewish communities in Palestine. What's remarkable about the Hebrew revival is that it demonstrates that language recovery is possible. A language that was dead, no native speakers remaining, was brought back to life, not by some accident of history or fortunate discovery of new texts, but by human will and effort. People decided that this language mattered, and they dedicated themselves to preserving and reviving it. But the Hebrew revival also shows how resource-intensive language preservation is. It required institutions, it required education, it required political support, it required a community willing to invest time and effort. Not all endangered language preservation movements have access to these resources. Cornish, another Celtic language, had very few speakers by the 20th century. Language enthusiasts began a revival movement. There are now learners of Cornish and even some semi-fluent speakers. But Cornish has never achieved the status of Hebrew. It's not a native language for any children born today. It remains a minority language, learned by enthusiasts, rather than a language that's integrated into the daily life of a community. Irish, similarly, was nearly suppressed under English rule. It was forbidden in schools. Children were punished for speaking it. By the early 20th century, the number of Irish speakers had declined dramatically. But Irish independence led to efforts to revive the language. Today, Irish is an official language of Ireland. It's taught in schools. It's used in government contexts. Yet despite these official efforts, the number of daily speakers remains relatively low. Most Irish citizens can read Irish because they learned it in school, but they don't speak it regularly. These examples reveal an important truth. Language preservation and revival aren't simple problems with simple solutions. They require sustained effort over generations. They require resources. They require community buy-in. They require institutional support. And even when all these factors are present, success isn't guaranteed. But what these examples also show is that language death isn't inevitable. It's not a natural process that happens to us beyond our control. It's something we choose to allow or to resist. Communities can choose to preserve their languages. Governments can choose to support that preservation. And sometimes, against the odds, communities succeed in keeping their languages alive or even reviving them from near death. But there's something even more insidious than active suppression of a living language. It's the deliberate erasure of memory itself, the systematic effort not just to stop people from speaking a language, but to ensure that the language never existed in the first place, to rewrite history so that people forget that other civilizations, other ways of thinking ever existed. The ancient Romans practiced something called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. When a powerful person fell out of favor, the Romans would systematically erase their name from inscriptions and records. Statues would be smashed. Coins would be melted down. It was as if the person had never existed. The goal wasn't just to punish the person, but to ensure that future generations would forget them entirely. The same principle has been applied to languages and entire civilizations. The Minoan civilization, one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean world, was largely forgotten. After the Mycenaean Greeks conquered Crete, the Minoan civilization declined, and over centuries knowledge of it faded. The Minoans became legendary, a race of people who lived underground with a half-human, half-bull creature called the Minotaur. The actual civilization, their achievements, their writing system, their way of life, all of this faded into legend and myth. The Egyptians themselves rewrite their own history. They had a chronological tradition that didn't always match what archaeologists have reconstructed. They erased some pharaohs from official records or recorded them with deliberately inaccurate information. Their own monuments sometimes contain lies about their own history. This wasn't accident. It was deliberate manipulation of the historical record. Colonial powers engaged in epistemicide, the killing of knowledge systems. When the Spanish conquered the Americas, they didn't just suppress native languages. They systematically categorized indigenous knowledge as primitive and inferior. They documented indigenous languages. Yes, but they documented them in a way that highlighted their supposed inferiority. The categorization itself was a form of violence. It was saying, your way of thinking is primitive. Your way of understanding is backward. There's only one legitimate way to know, and it's European. And the problem is that this erasure is often invisible. It doesn't feel violent because it happens through institutional processes, through educational systems, through the gradual reframing of history. A language is classified as a dying language, which might be technically accurate, but frames the loss as inevitable, as natural, rather than as the result of specific choices about resource allocation and cultural value. Governments don't actively forbid minority languages anymore in most places. They don't need to. The market does it. Children attend schools where the national language is the language of instruction. Media and entertainment are in the national language. Economic opportunity requires the national language. The infrastructure of linguistic dominance is in place, and it doesn't require explicit suppression. It works through subtle incentives and structural forces, and this is perhaps the most insidious form of forgetting. It's forgetting that happens through inaction. It's the failure to invest in preserving minority languages. It's the choice to allocate educational resources to dominant languages rather than endangered languages. It's the assumption that some languages don't matter because few people speak them. The truth is that language loss is always, at some level, a choice. Not a choice made by the speakers of the dying language. They might desperately want to preserve it, but a choice made by societies about what languages they value and what languages they're willing to allow to disappear. Right now, we're making choices about which languages will survive and which will die. And we're often making those choices without even realizing we're making them. Every year, David Harrison packs his equipment and travels to remote villages. He brings recording devices, he brings notebooks, he brings a determination that verges on obsession. His goal is simple and heartbreaking: to document languages that might not exist in a decade. He arrives at a village and finds the remaining speakers of a language. Often, there are only a handful, sometimes fewer. The speakers are usually elderly. They've lived their entire lives speaking this language, but their children speak a dominant national language instead. Their grandchildren might understand some words in the heritage language, but they speak the dominant language fluently. Harrison's job is to record the language. He records the sounds, the grammar, the way words are structured. He creates detailed phonetic transcriptions. He documents how the language expresses concepts that other languages might express differently. He works with speakers to create dictionaries. He trains community members, when possible, to continue the documentation work after he leaves. The emotional aspect of this work is staggering. You're documenting something that will probably disappear. The person speaking to you sharing their language, knows they're one of the last. They know that when they're gone, something will be lost forever. Some speakers are motivated by this urgency. They want to ensure that their language is remembered. They want future generations to know that their people existed, that their way of thinking existed. But others are resigned. They've watched the language decline. They've seen the younger generation abandon it. So they know that their efforts to preserve it, while appreciated, probably won't be successful. A language requires a community of speakers to survive. If that community no longer exists, the language dies regardless of how many recordings are made. Harrison's work is a form of respect. It says, your language matters, your way of speaking matters. I'm going to dedicate my time to ensuring that a record of it exists. That long after the last speaker is gone, people will be able to hear your voice. They'll be able to study your language. They'll understand that you had a unique way of thinking about the world. There are other linguists doing similar work around the world. Andrew George, as mentioned earlier, has spent decades on the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary texts we have. He translates it, he interprets it, he tries to understand not just what the words mean, but what they meant to the people who wrote them and recited them. These scholars are united by a particular personality type. They're obsessive. They care deeply about things that most people consider irrelevant. They're willing to spend years on a problem that nobody else cares about. They're meticulous. They're detail-oriented. They're willing to sit in libraries or remote villages and do painstaking work because they believe that work matters. The modern linguist is not just a scholar. They're also an advocate. Many linguists work directly with endangered language communities to establish language education programs. They help communities create written standards for languages that have been primarily oral. They work to convince governments that endangered languages deserve funding and institutional support. These scholars often face skepticism. Non-specialists frequently ask, why does it matter? Why waste resources preserving languages that few people speak? From an economic perspective, this question makes sense. But linguists understand that the value of language preservation isn't primarily economic. It's human. Each language represents a unique way of thinking. Each language encodes centuries or millennia of accumulated knowledge about how to live in a specific environment, how to organize society, how to understand the world. When a language dies, a way of thinking dies. We lose information about human possibility. We lose diversity of perspective. We lose ways of being in the world that we might desperately need in the future. The obsessiveness of these scholars is essential. Without people willing to dedicate their lives to understanding and preserving languages that the broader society has written off as unimportant, those languages would simply disappear. There would be no record. There would be no memory. There would be nothing but silence. 30 years ago, documenting an endangered language was physically difficult. A linguist would travel to a remote community with heavy recording equipment, tape recorders, notebooks, sometimes cameras. They would conduct interviews. They would transcribe by hand. They would return home with hundreds of pages of handwritten notes and hours of tape recordings. The work was slow and cumbersome. Technology has transformed this process. Modern recording devices are small and portable. They record high-quality audio. A linguist can now capture not just words, but the nuances of pronunciation, the rhythm of speech, the way speakers emphasize different syllables. Digital databases allow scholars to organize and search linguistic data in ways that would have been impossible before. High-resolution imaging has revolutionized the study of ancient texts. Technologies like multispectral imaging can reveal hidden text written over by later scribes, text that has faded to invisibility. A manuscript that has been considered illegible for centuries can be scanned with multispectral imaging, and suddenly hidden letters bloom into visibility. Technology didn't decipher the language, but it made the text visible again. Sometimes visibility is all you need. Ancient artifacts are now being scanned and digitized. A scholar in a university in New York can study artifacts that are physically housed in museums in Cairo or London. Digital archives are preserving linguistic knowledge in ways that are more permanent than physical artifacts could ever be. A recording of a language can be duplicated infinitely. It can be stored in multiple locations. It can be accessible to researchers globally. Linguistic databases like WALS, World Atlas of Language Structures, collect comparative data on languages from around the world. They allow researchers to identify patterns across thousands of languages. What features appear in all languages? What variations exist? How do different languages structure meaning? These databases enable a kind of linguistic research that would have been impossible without technology. Comparative analysis on a global scale, machine learning and artificial intelligence are beginning to be applied to linguistic problems. Neural networks can be trained to recognize patterns in undeciphered texts. They can't understand meaning, but they can identify probable relationships between symbols. They can suggest possible phonetic values. They can assist human linguists in their work, not replacing human insight, but augmenting it. The digital humanities, more broadly, have transformed academic collaboration. Scholars can now work together across institutions and across geographic distances. A scholar in Japan can collaborate in real time with a scholar in Brazil. Open access research platforms allow knowledge to be shared freely. Crowdsourcing projects allow non-specialists to contribute to linguistic and historical projects. Thousands of volunteers can transcribe ancient texts or categorize linguistic data. But technology has its limits. A machine can recognize patterns, but it can't understand meaning in the way a human can. Artificial intelligence can assist in analysis, but it can't replace linguistic knowledge and human intuition. A digital archive can preserve a language indefinitely, but it can't bring a language back to life without speakers willing to learn it. The ultimate limitation is this: technology can preserve the voice of a language, the sounds, the recordings, the written texts. But a language is more than its sounds and grammar. A language is a living thing. It's spoken by people. It changes based on how speakers use it. It's embedded in a community and a culture. You can digitally preserve every word of a language and still lose something essential if the community of speakers disappears. Still, for endangered languages, technology offers hope. It offers the possibility of preservation. It offers the possibility that even if a language dies, a record of it will survive. Future Generations will be able to hear the voices of speakers. They'll be able to study the language. They might even be able to revive it, as Hebrew was revived. When linguists study ancient and endangered languages, they sometimes encounter things they don't expect. Discoveries that challenge assumptions about human intelligence and sophistication. Languages that scholars assumed were primitive turn out to be remarkably complex. Australian Aboriginal languages have grammatical systems that many Indo-European languages lack. They have ways of expressing certain concepts that European languages simply don't have. They encode information about spatial relationships, about relationships between people, about certainty and uncertainty in ways that create fundamentally different ways of perceiving the world. Some languages have dedicated grammatical markers for distinguishing between information the speaker learned from direct personal experience and information the speaker learned from hearsay. This isn't a minor feature, it's a fundamental distinction built into the grammar of the language. It means that speakers of these languages literally think differently about the sources of knowledge. They distinguish between direct knowledge and reported knowledge in a way that's grammatically embedded in how they speak. Some languages have separate grammatical forms for inclusive and exclusive we. In English, we say we regardless of whether we're including the listener or not. Some languages have two different words for we, one that includes the listener and one that excludes them. This might seem like a small distinction, but it's profound. It means that speakers of these languages are constantly making a grammatical choice about whether they're including others in their perspective or excluding them. Some languages grammatically obligate their speakers to specify cardinal directions. If you want to say the person to my left, you have to use the cardinal directions. You have to know which way is north, south, east, or west. Linguistic research has shown that speakers of these languages have demonstrably better spatial navigation abilities than speakers of languages without this grammatical obligatory. The language literally shapes the way people perceive space. These discoveries are revolutionary because they overturn assumptions about the relationship between language and intelligence. The assumption used to be that there was a hierarchy of languages, that some languages were more sophisticated than others. European languages were assumed to be at the top of this hierarchy because they were the languages of literate and technologically advanced civilizations. But the research revealed that this hierarchy was wrong. All human languages are equally complex. Languages might differ in which features they emphasize. Some languages are very specific about spatial relationships, others less so, but no language is simpler or more primitive than any other. All languages are equally capable of expressing any concept. All languages are equally capable of serving as the vehicle for sophisticated thinking. This discovery has profound implications. It means that differences in human civilizations weren't caused by linguistic limitations. The Mayans weren't less intelligent than the Greeks. The Egyptians weren't less intelligent than the Romans. They had different languages, certainly, and those languages shaped their thinking in different ways. But there was no hierarchy. There was no ranking of civilizations based on intelligence. Every newly deciphered language and every newly understood linguistic structure reveals the same thing. Human cognitive ability is constant across cultures and time periods. All humans are equally intelligent. All humans are equally capable of sophisticated thought. What differs is what they chose to think about and how they chose to solve problems based on their environmental and cultural contexts. Ancient Babylonian tablets containing sophisticated mathematical solutions show us that the Babylonians were solving problems we don't typically encounter until advanced university mathematics. The Mayans were calculating astronomical cycles with remarkable precision. The Egyptians were understanding anatomy deeply enough to perform surgical procedures. And all of this was being done in ancient times by people using completely different frameworks for organizing knowledge. The study of language diversity reminds us that human possibility is far broader than we usually assume. We tend to think that our way of thinking is the way of thinking. Our way of organizing knowledge is the right way. Our approach to solving problems is the optimal approach. But the study of ancient and endangered languages reveals that there are countless other ways to think, to organize knowledge, to approach problems. And losing languages means losing those alternatives. The study of ancient languages has profoundly influenced modern linguistic theory and philosophy. One of the most important concepts to emerge from linguistic research is linguistic relativity, the idea that language shapes thought. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, developed in the early 20th century, proposed that language fundamentally shapes how speakers perceive the world. Different languages would lead to different worldviews because they structure information in different ways. This hypothesis was revolutionary and controversial. Some scholars embraced it. Others rejected it as too extreme. But research into language diversity has largely supported some version of linguistic relativity, while also showing that it's more nuanced than early proponents suggested. Language doesn't completely determine thought, but it does influence it. The categories that a language makes grammatically obligatory affect how speakers think. The distinctions a language enforces affect what speakers pay attention to. A speaker of a language that obligates specification of direction will be more attentive to cardinal directions than a speaker of a language without this feature. A speaker of a language that distinguishes between inclusive and exclusive we will be more attentive to questions of group membership. A speaker of a language that marks evidentiality, distinguishing between direct knowledge and hearsay, will be more attentive to the sources of knowledge claims. This has implications for how we think about human cognitive difference. Intelligence isn't distributed unequally across populations, but different populations speaking different languages and develop expertise in different domains. Someone raised speaking a language that emphasizes spatial relationships will develop better spatial reasoning. Someone raised speaking a language that emphasizes social relationships will develop better social reasoning. The study of ancient languages has contributed to our understanding of language universals, features that appear in all human languages. All languages have consonants and vowels. All languages have words. All languages have some way of expressing negation. All languages have words for basic colors and kin relationships. The existence of these universals suggests something fundamental about human language capacity. But the variation within these universals is equally profound. While all languages have colors words, they don't all have the same number of color categories. And some languages distinguish between warm colors and cool colors. Others distinguish based on brightness. Still others organize colors in completely different ways. The universal, the fact that languages categorize color, exists alongside profound variation in how that categorization happens. The study of how languages change over time has revolutionized our understanding of human prehistory. By comparing related languages and identifying patterns of change, linguists can reconstruct ancestral languages. The fact that Latin gave rise to the Romance languages is obvious to any modern observer. But the fact that Sanskrit, Latin, Germanic languages, Celtic languages, and many others all descended from a common ancestor, Proto-Indo-European, was a remarkable discovery. Linguistic data has been combined with genetic and archaeological data to create a more complete picture of human prehistory. Where did Proto-Indo-European speakers originate? Where did they migrate? How did their languages spread? Linguistic analysis suggests that Proto-Indo-European speakers originated around 4000 BCE in the Pontic steppe. Genetic evidence has corroborated this. Archaeological evidence shows patterns of migration consistent with this linguistic hypothesis. The fact that language, genetics, and archaeology can be combined to reconstruct human prehistory is remarkable. It suggests that language is not just a tool for communication, but also a record of human history, encoded in the structure and evolution of languages themselves. The broader implication is that human linguistic and cognitive diversity is fundamental to human flourishing. Different languages represent different ways of organizing knowledge and perceiving reality. A world with less linguistic diversity is a world with less cognitive diversity. It's a world with fewer perspectives available to us. It's a world that is somehow impoverished. The study of ancient languages has profoundly influenced modern linguistic theory and philosophy. One of the most important concepts to emerge from linguistic research is linguistic relativity, the idea that language shapes thought. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, developed in the early 20th century, proposed that language fundamentally shapes how speakers perceive the world. Different languages would lead to different worldviews because they structure information in different ways. This hypothesis was revolutionary and controversial. Some scholars embraced it. Others rejected it as too extreme. But research into language diversity has largely supported some version of linguistic relativity, while also showing that it's more nuanced than early proponents suggested. Language doesn't completely determine thought, but it does influence it. The categories that a language makes grammatically obligatory affect how speakers think. The distinctions a language enforces affect what speakers pay attention to. A speaker of a language that obligates specification of direction will be more attentive to cardinal directions than a speaker of a language without this feature. A speaker of a language that distinguishes between inclusive and exclusive we will be more attentive to questions of group membership. A speaker of a language that marks evidentiality, distinguishing between direct knowledge and hearsay, will be more attentive to the sources of knowledge claims. This has implications for how we think about human cognitive difference. Intelligence isn't distributed unequally across populations, but different populations speaking different languages, and develop expertise in different domains. Someone raised speaking a language that emphasizes spatial relationships will develop better spatial reasoning. Someone raised speaking a language that emphasizes social relationships will develop better social reasoning. The study of ancient languages has contributed to our understanding of language universals, features that appear in all human languages. All languages have consonants and vowels. All languages have words. All languages have some way of expressing negation. All languages have words for basic colors and kin relationships. The existence of these universals suggests something fundamental about human language capacity. But the variation within these universals is equally profound. While all languages have colors words, they don't all have the same number of color categories. And some languages distinguish between warm colors and cool colors. Others distinguish based on brightness. Still others organize colors in completely different ways. The universal, the fact that languages categorize color, exists alongside profound variation in how that categorization happens. The study of how languages change over time has revolutionized our understanding of human prehistory. By comparing related languages and identifying patterns of change, linguists can reconstruct ancestral languages. The fact that Latin gave rise to the Romance languages is obvious to any modern observer. But the fact that Sanskrit, Latin, Germanic languages, Celtic languages, and many others all descended from a common ancestor, Proto-Indo-European, was a remarkable discovery. Linguistic data has been combined with genetic and archaeological data to create a more complete picture of human prehistory. Where did Proto-Indo-European speakers originate? Where did they migrate? How did their languages spread? Linguistic analysis suggests that Proto-Indo-European speakers originated around 4000 BCE in the Pontic steppe. Genetic evidence has corroborated this. Archaeological evidence shows patterns of migration consistent with this linguistic hypothesis. The fact that language, genetics, and archaeology can be combined to reconstruct human prehistory is remarkable. It suggests that language is not just a tool for communication, but also a record of human history, encoded in the structure and evolution of languages themselves. The broader implication is that human linguistic and cognitive diversity is fundamental to human flourishing. Different languages represent different ways of organizing knowledge and perceiving reality. A world with less linguistic diversity is a world with less cognitive diversity. It's a world with fewer perspectives available to us. It's a world that is somehow impoverished. There was a word in an Australian Aboriginal language for a particular type of landscape relationship. It didn't mean forest or clearing or any simple spatial designation. It meant something more like land that is maintained through specific practices, land that is the result of human care and attention, land that exists in relationship with a community of people who understand how to live within it. When that language died, that word died, and with it, a concept that might be essential for how we understand our relationship to the environment. This isn't nostalgia or romanticism. This is about real knowledge that was lost. Knowledge about how to live sustainably. Knowledge about how to maintain ecosystems. Knowledge that was encoded not just in vocabulary, but in the grammatical structures of the language. You couldn't speak that language without constantly reinforcing your understanding of the interconnection between humans and land. Ecological knowledge, encoded in endangered languages, represents centuries or millennia of accumulated understanding about how to live in specific environments. An Amazonian language encodes knowledge about medicinal plants, about which plants are poisonous and which are healing, about which combinations of plants create medicines. This knowledge was developed through careful observation and experiment over generations. It represents a kind of scientific method, hypothesis, testing, refinement, developed in a different cultural context. When those languages disappear, that ecological knowledge becomes scattered or is lost entirely. It might exist in written form somewhere, undocumented by anthropologists or linguists. But much of it might not be documented, and even if it is documented, the knowledge is separated from its original context. It's removed from the language that gave it structure and meaning. Indigenous languages also encode spiritual and philosophical knowledge, cosmologies that differ from Western frameworks, ethical systems that organize values differently than Western ethics do, understandings of the relationship between humans, animals, plants, and the land that are sophisticated and consistent, but fundamentally different from how modern Western society conceptualizes these relationships. When a language dies, these alternative frameworks disappear. We're left with fewer ways of thinking about existence. We're left with fewer possible answers to fundamental human questions. We might desperately need one of those frameworks to address a problem we currently face, but we'll never know because the framework has already been lost. The loss of linguistic diversity is loss of human possibility. It's the loss of different ways of solving problems. When the Dalmatian language died with Tuon Udina in 1898, a Romance language with unique features disappeared. Questions about how Romance languages developed and evolved that could have been answered by studying Dalmatian now cannot be answered. That knowledge is simply gone. The loss of indigenous languages in the Americas represents the loss of perspectives developed over thousands of years by people living in specific environments. Those perspectives created sustainable societies. They created cultures that flourished for generations without destroying the ecological systems they depended on. We desperately need that knowledge now as we face ecological crisis. But much of it is already lost, encoded in languages that are no longer spoken. Some efforts exist to preserve at least some of this knowledge. Recordings of elder speakers, written dictionaries, language revitalization programs, the recognition that some knowledge can be transmitted even if the language itself isn't fully revived. But these efforts often come too late. By the time the urgency is recognized, speakers are already gone. Languages are already dead. The conversations we've lost represent futures that will never be. Different ways of organizing society that will never be tried. Different approaches to solving human problems that will never be explored. The silence that falls when a language dies is not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of possibility. It's knowledge that we had a chance to learn and didn't. It's wisdom that existed somewhere in the world and has now disappeared forever. In a museum somewhere, behind glass, or in a collection, there are messages from a civilization that nobody can read. Linear A texts sit in storage. Scholars look at them, they photograph them, they study them, and they still cannot read them. The writing is right there. It's clearly intentional. It's clearly meaningful. But it remains locked. Linear A was used by the Minoan civilization before Linear B emerged. We know from context that Linear A was used for administrative and religious purposes. We can see differences in how different texts are formatted, suggesting that different types of information were recorded differently. But we cannot read the actual words. We cannot understand the actual meanings. Hundreds of examples exist, and yet we're essentially helpless in front of them. The frustration that Linear A represents is unique. We're not dealing with a script so fragmentary that interpretation is impossible. We're dealing with hundreds of examples of a complete writing system. We're dealing with evidence, we're dealing with information, and yet the key remains missing. Without a bilingual text, without the crucial artifact that would give us a translation, we cannot decipher it. Linguists have hypothesized about Linear A. The language was probably not Greek. It might be related to languages spoken in Anatolia. It might be a language isolate with no known relatives. But these are hypotheses, they're educated guesses based on fragmentary evidence. Nobody knows for certain. The Indus Valley script represents a different kind of mystery. The Indus Valley civilization was enormous. They had sophisticated cities. They had trade networks that stretched across vast distances. They had a complete writing system. Thousands of examples of their script have been discovered on seals and pottery and tablets, and we still cannot read it. The mystery is compounded by the fact that we don't even know for certain if the script represents language at all. Most scholars believe it does, but the texts are typically very short. A phrase on a seal might be just a few symbols long. Without longer text, without context, without a bilingual key, scholars are stuck. Computer analysis has been applied to the Indus Valley script. Machine learning algorithms have analyzed the patterns. Scholars have looked for relationships to other known scripts, but nothing definitive has emerged. The script remains a mystery. The civilization's voice remains unheard. Irongorongo represents perhaps the most enigmatic mystery. These symbols are carved into wooden tablets found on Easter Island. They're remarkable artifacts, but scholars debate whether they constitute writing at all. The tablets were carved with precision and care, but maybe they served a different purpose. Maybe they're decorative, maybe they're musical notation, maybe they represent a proto-writing system that never fully developed. We have very few tablets preserved. We have minimal context for understanding them. And the culture that created them has changed dramatically. The population of Easter Island was devastated by disease and colonization. The connection to the culture that created Rongorongo has been largely severed. The Cretan hieroglyphic script predates Linear A and remains almost entirely undeciphered. It's even more fragmentary than Linear A. Fewer examples survive, the context is less clear. Each of these scripts represents a civilization that tried to preserve its voice and partially succeeded. The physical remains survived, but we lack the keys to hear what they were saying. The evidence is there, the information exists, but the method of accessing it remains unknown. The possibility remains that new discoveries could change everything. Maybe a bilingual text will emerge from an archaeological dig. Maybe new methodologies will allow us to decode scripts that currently resist decipherment. Maybe technological advances will provide tools we don't yet have. But there's also the possibility that some of these mysteries will remain permanently unsolvable, that some knowledge will be forever beyond our reach. Right now, somewhere in the world, an old person is speaking a language. That person is one of the last remaining speakers of that language. Maybe there are 10 speakers left, maybe 50, maybe just a few hundred, but they know that when they die, the language will die with them, or more likely, in another generation, because their children speak a dominant national language instead. This is happening everywhere, simultaneously. Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Nigeria, Mexico, Cameroon. These regions contain the highest linguistic diversity and also experience the fastest linguistic decline. Hundreds of languages are being lost. In some cases, languages are disappearing before they're even documented. The mechanism of modern language loss is relentless and seemingly inevitable. Young people leave villages for economic opportunity in cities. So in cities, the dominant national language is necessary for survival. Why would you teach your children a language that nobody in the city speaks? Why would you preserve a language that has no economic value? The logic is harsh, but understandable. You want your children to have opportunities. You want them to succeed, and success requires speaking the dominant language. Meanwhile, education systems teach in dominant languages. Media and entertainment are in dominant languages. Economic incentives all point toward learning dominant languages. Minority languages become associated with the past, with tradition, with limited opportunity. Young people embrace dominant languages and let heritage languages fade. Ainu, the language of the indigenous people of Japan, once had hundreds of thousands of speakers. Now it has a few thousand, mostly elderly. The language is in terminal decline. There are revitalization efforts underway, immersion schools where children can learn Ainu. But the trajectory is clear. In a generation or two, the language will probably be gone. Siri, spoken in Mexico, has around 700 speakers. Young people are leaving communities for economic opportunity. They're speaking Spanish instead of Siri. The language is declining. Similar stories could be told about countless languages around the world, but there are also success stories. Welsh, nearly dead in the 19th century, has been revived through educational efforts and political support. It's now an official language of Wales. More Welsh speakers exist now than in the early 20th century. Hawaiian, displaced by English, is experiencing revival through immersion schools. And these successes show that language loss isn't inevitable. The difference is that these successful revitalization efforts required sustained commitment. They required resources. They required government support. They required communities that made a deliberate choice to preserve and revive their languages. And they required time, decades or more. These success stories reveal something crucial. Language death isn't natural. It's not something that happens without human agency. It's caused by specific choices about education, about resource allocation, about the value we place on cultural diversity. Languages die because we allow them to die, and they can be preserved or revived if we choose to invest in them. The gap between what's possible and what's actually being done is staggering. Most endangered languages receive almost no support. They're not taught in schools. They're not used in government contexts. They're not taught as second languages to outsiders. They're simply left to decline. And when the last speakers are gone, we mourn. We make documentaries about linguistic loss. We express regret. But by then, it's too late. The languages being lost right now are not ancient languages that we're trying to recover. They're living languages, still being spoken, still being used to communicate complex thoughts. There are people right now who speak these languages fluently. There are children who could learn these languages if given the opportunity. The loss isn't inevitable. It's preventable. The challenge is that prevention requires action. It requires communities choosing to teach heritage languages to their children, despite the economic pressures against doing so. It requires governments investing in minority language education. It requires societies deciding that linguistic diversity is valuable. It requires resources that are often scarce and contested. It requires overcoming the assumption that language loss is natural and inevitable, because it's not. When a language dies, something irreplaceable is lost. Not just information, not just vocabulary, but an entire way of thinking about the world, an entire framework for understanding existence, an entire perspective on what it means to be human. For Indigenous and minority communities, the loss of language is also the loss of identity. Language isn't just a communication tool. It's a carrier of culture. It's connected to spirituality, to history, to the stories that explain who you are and where you come from. When a language dies, a community loses part of its connection to its ancestors and its past. Every language encodes knowledge about how to live in a specific place. An Amazonian language encodes knowledge about the forest. An Arctic language encodes knowledge about ice and snow. A desert language encodes knowledge about aridity. This knowledge was developed through generations of careful observation and adaptation. When languages die, this knowledge is scattered or lost. Some of this knowledge exists in written form, documented by anthropologists or linguists, but much of it exists primarily in the language itself, embedded in the grammatical structures, in the vocabulary choices, in the way speakers conceptualize relationships. That knowledge is difficult or impossible to fully extract and preserve in written form. Different languages represent different ways of organizing human thought. Some languages are very specific about spatial relationships. Others are very specific about social relationships. Others are very specific about temporal relationships or causal relationships. And each language represents a different way of slicing up reality and organizing concepts. When linguistic diversity declines, cognitive diversity declines. Fewer ways of thinking are available to us. Fewer approaches to solving human problems are available. We lose access to perspectives that might help us address our current challenges. An Australian Aboriginal language with words for sustainable relationships with land might be crucial knowledge if we're facing environmental collapse. But if that language is already dead, we'll never know what we've lost. The future implications are sobering. If linguistic diversity continues to decline at current rates, with approximately one language dying every 9 days, then in 100 years, the number of languages will have declined by roughly half. Say this will represent the loss of countless ways of thinking and understanding the world. What would a world with diminished linguistic diversity look like? It would be a world with fewer perspectives, fewer approaches to solving problems, fewer ways of understanding what it means to be human. It would be a world that has lost something essential about human diversity. There's a counter-argument worth considering. Some argue that linguistic diversity is a luxury that communities voluntarily abandon in pursuit of economic opportunity. They argue that language preservation efforts sometimes impose linguists' values on communities, trying to keep languages alive against the community's own choices. There's truth in this. Language preservation can be paternalistic, and communities do make choices to adopt dominant languages for economic reasons. But this counter-argument doesn't negate the value of preservation. It just means that preservation must be community-led. It must be genuinely desired by the speakers themselves, not imposed from outside. When communities want to preserve their languages and lack resources to do so, that's different from when communities have freely chosen to abandon their languages in pursuit of economic opportunity. Some language loss is probably inevitable, but the rate of loss is not inevitable. It's shaped by choices we make about education, about resources, about cultural value. We can choose differently. An ancient priest carved a prayer into stone. He didn't know that his civilization would fall. He didn't know that the language he was writing in would become incomprehensible to all but a handful of scholars thousands of years later. He carved the prayer, trusting that someone, somehow, someday would understand. He believed that his words had permanence. He believed that his prayers would transcend death and time. We are those someday people. We hold that stone and read those words, and something sacred happens when we do. We answer an ancient prayer. We acknowledge an ancient expectation. We fulfill the intention that someone had when they carved words into stone, knowing they might not be understood, but believing that they deserved to be preserved anyway. This is what decipherment really is. It's not just acquiring information. It's not just academic exercise. It's a form of respect. It's honoring the intentions of people who tried to reach across time to us. It's saying your voice matters. Your thoughts deserve to be heard. Your civilization deserves to be remembered. When Champollion decoded Egyptian hieroglyphics, he answered a 3,000-year-old question. Scribes had written with the expectation that someone would read them. Champollion made that expectation real. The dead spoke, and the living listened. Similarly, when indigenous peoples whose languages are endangered work with linguists to document and preserve their languages, they're making a choice to preserve their voice. They're saying, our way of thinking matters. Our perspective is worth preserving. Our language deserves to exist in the future, even if nobody speaks it daily. They're saying, please remember us. Please remember that we existed. Please remember that we had something to say. What it means to listen to the dead is to accept that people vastly separated from us by time nonetheless have something to teach. It means recognizing that different doesn't mean inferior, that ancient people were as intelligent and sophisticated as we are. They just thought about different things, using different frameworks to solve different problems. It means approaching the past with humility, recognizing that our current way of thinking is not the pinnacle of human achievement. It's not the peak toward which all human civilization has been progressing. It's simply one among many possible ways of thinking. Other times have had other ways, other cultures have had other approaches, and we can learn from them. When we read ancient Egyptian texts about death and afterlife, we encounter a completely different way of thinking about mortality. The Egyptian perspective on what happens after death continues to influence modern spirituality. When we read ancient philosophical texts that are thousands of years old, we discover that ancient people were asking the same fundamental questions we ask. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? These are eternal human questions. Different times have answered them differently. When we study ancient approaches to architecture and urban planning, we notice that modern cities are beginning to relearn lessons that ancient civilizations already understood. How to create public spaces, how to organize cities so they serve the people who live in them, how to balance density and green space. And these are current challenges, but ancient civilizations address them successfully. Learning from the dead isn't about imitating them. It's not about returning to the past. It's about expanding our understanding of what's possible. It's about recognizing that human achievement and human wisdom come in many forms. It's about understanding that there are always alternative approaches, alternative frameworks, alternative ways of thinking that we might not have considered. The study of lost and recovered languages is fundamentally about respect. Respect for those who came before us. Respect for the diversity of human thought. Respect for the permanence of human voice. Even when empires fall and civilizations disappear, their voices can still reach us across the millennia if we're patient enough to listen. This listening is sacred work. It's sacred because it honors the dead. It's sacred because it acknowledges the value of human expression. It's sacred because it insists that some things, like the voice of a human being, recorded for posterity, are worth preserving regardless of their economic utility. The act of decipherment is an act of faith. Faith that the dead speak to us, faith that their voices matter, faith that time itself is not an absolute barrier to human connection. We have knowledge that previous generations didn't have. We understand why linguistic diversity matters. We understand the cognitive and cultural value of preserving languages. We have tools that previous generations didn't have. Digital recording technology, digital archives, machine learning applications. We have the capability to preserve languages in ways that were impossible in the past. The question now is whether we have the will and the resources to act on this knowledge. Language documentation is the foundational work, recording native speakers, creating detailed transcriptions of grammar and pronunciation, building dictionaries, making audio available to future researchers. This work is slow and meticulous, but it's essential. If a language dies, at least a record of it exists. That record could allow future generations to revive the language or to study it. It preserves the possibility of recovery. Language education programs are crucial. Communities where language is at risk need schools that teach the heritage language. Ideally, immersion schools where all instruction is in the heritage language. These schools allow children to become fluent speakers. They create a new generation that carries the language forward. The success of Hawaiian and Welsh language revitalization programs demonstrates that this approach works. Policy changes matter. Governments can grant official status to minority languages. They can require bilingual education. They can use minority languages in government contexts. These changes signal that the language is valuable. They create institutional support for the language. They make learning the language practically useful, not just culturally significant. Investment in linguistic research is essential. The field is underfunded relative to its importance. Linguists documenting endangered languages often work with minimal resources. Universities are cutting funding for linguistics programs. Government support for linguistic research has declined, yet this is the moment when such research is most critical. Languages are disappearing faster now than at any point in human history, and we're simultaneously cutting resources to document and preserve them. Technology offers tools that linguists should leverage more fully. Digital archives allow languages to be preserved indefinitely. Our machine learning applications might help with language learning. Software that could assist someone trying to learn an endangered language by providing practice and feedback. Social media could be used to promote minority languages and create communities of speakers. Community-based approaches are essential. The most successful language preservation efforts involve communities making deliberate choices to preserve their languages. This might involve teaching children in the home. It might involve creating written literature in the language. It might involve using the language in educational and public contexts. When community members feel ownership of the preservation effort, when they see the language as valuable for their own identity and future, preservation has the best chance of success. The economics question is complex. Does it make economic sense to invest resources in preserving languages that few people speak? From a purely economic perspective, the answer is no. The economic utility is minimal. But language preservation isn't primarily an economic question. It's a human question. What kind of world do we want to live in? One where human diversity is recognized and preserved, or one where languages continue to disappear until only a handful remain? Different voices within this debate matter. Indigenous and minority communities speaking for themselves, linguists advocating for the importance of language documentation, philosophers arguing that linguistic diversity is intrinsically valuable, policymakers deciding how to allocate resources. Every voice contributes to the conversation about what we value and what we're willing to invest in. The personal dimension is often overlooked. Individual people can learn endangered languages. Individual people can support community language programs. Individual people can teach their children the importance of linguistic diversity. Individual people can value and respect languages different from their own. The sum of individual choices shapes what happens to endangered languages. Preserving linguistic diversity is not the responsibility of linguists alone. It's not the responsibility of governments alone. It's a shared responsibility. Communities, educators, researchers, policymakers, and individuals all have roles to play. The future of linguistic diversity depends on choices we make collectively every day in our decisions about what languages we speak, what languages we teach, and what languages we value. The conversation between past and future between ancient voices and modern ears, between different languages and different ways of thinking, is the very essence of what makes us human. It's how we learn, it's how we grow, it's how we avoid the trap of thinking that our way is the only way. Throughout human history, people have tried to reach across time. They've carved words in stone, they've written on papyrus, they've pressed symbols into clay, they've done everything they could to make their voice permanent, to ensure that long after they died, someone would know they existed. Someone would know what they thought. Someone would hear what they had to say. And we are the recipients of those messages. We are the people they were trying to reach. We have a responsibility to listen. We have a responsibility to honor the intention that someone had when they wrote something down, knowing it might not be understood, but choosing to preserve it anyway. The future is being shaped by the choices we make about language and linguistic diversity right now. Every time a community chooses to teach its heritage language to its children, a conversation is preserved. Every time a linguist documents an endangered language, a potential loss is prevented. Every time an ancient language is deciphered, a new perspective on human knowledge and thought becomes available to us. These choices aren't abstract, they're concrete. They happen in schools when teachers decide what language to use for instruction. They happen in homes when parents decide what language to speak to their children. They happen in policy offices when government officials decide what languages to support. They happen in libraries and museums when institutions decide what languages to preserve and make available. Preserving linguistic diversity is a way of saying that we value different ways of thinking, that we recognize that human wisdom comes in many forms, that no single perspective has the complete truth about how to understand or live in the world. It's saying that a farmer in Papua New Guinea who speaks a language unknown to the outside world has something to teach us, that an indigenous person whose language is on the edge of extinction has something to contribute, that a monk in Tibet preserving an ancient language is doing sacred work. The opening metaphor of this exploration was silence, the absence of meaning, the inability to understand a message that exists. We've traced how that silence came about, how languages were lost through conquest and suppression and neglect, how some languages were recovered through brilliant observation and persistence, how other languages remain locked, resistant to our best efforts to understand them, how new languages are dying right now, their silence falling even as we speak. But silence, we've learned, is not empty, it's full of ghosts. The silence of lost languages is full of voices trying to speak across time. The silence of undeciphered scripts is full of meaning, waiting to be understood. The silence of endangered languages is full of knowledge that we haven't learned yet. The story of lost languages is not a tragedy with an ending. It's an ongoing conversation. So it continues as long as humans exist to listen, to study, to speak, and to preserve. It will continue into the future, shaped by choices we make now. Will we listen to the dead? Will we preserve the voices of the living? Will we open ourselves to ways of thinking that are different from our own? Will we recognize that linguistic diversity is worth protecting? These questions don't have simple answers. But the fact that we're asking them, that we recognize the value of what we stand to lose, is crucial. It means there's still time. Languages are still being spoken. Voices are still being raised. The conversation is still happening, and we still have the chance to participate in it fully. The last words of this exploration are an invitation to listen to the voices of the ancient dead, preserved in stone and clay, to listen to the voices of living communities, speaking endangered languages with diminishing numbers of speakers, to listen to the voices of scholars who dedicate their lives to understanding and preserving human linguistic expression, to listen with respect and attention to the full symphony of human language. The question is, what will we say? What will we preserve? What will we pass on to those who come after us? The conversation is eternal. We are its current speakers, and the words we choose, the languages we preserve, the diversity we protect, these will echo into the future, shaping what conversations are possible, what ways of thinking are available, what human possibilities remain alive. The silence we were asked to break at the beginning is breaking. Not completely, not for all lost languages, but for some. And in that breaking, we hear the voices of the dead speaking to us across time. We hear the call of the endangered languages still being spoken today. We hear the promise that human expression, human thought, human diversity can be preserved. We hear, finally, the beginning of an answer to the question with which we began. What wisdom did we almost lose? What perspectives did we almost let disappear forever? What conversations almost went silent? The answer is everything. Everything that makes human civilization rich and diverse and infinitely complex, and we still have time to listen.